Hims House, episode 26. I'm Jonathan Stern. I'm here with Patrick Lester, who goes by the name Bayside in the Hims House Discord. Today, we're joined by Martin Shkreli, one of the most provocative, outspoken, and honestly, one of the sharpest voices in all of healthcare. Martin is best known for founding Turing Pharmaceuticals and raising the price of Daraprim, the drug commonly used by AIDS patients, from $13.50 to $750 per pill, a move that made him a national villain overnight and earned him the nickname Pharma Bro. But what often gets lost in Martin's story is everything else. Martin has run hedge funds, founded biotech companies, and is one of the shrewdest commentators on how the healthcare system actually works. Drug pricing, intellectual property, compounding, incentives, all of it. Oh, and along the way, he bought the only copy of Wu-Tang Clan's secret album, Once Upon a Time in Shaolin, for $2 million. We are excited to have him here today to discuss the industry and, of course, to focus on what it all means for Hims and Hers. Martin, welcome to Hims House.
Hey, thank you so much.
So you do these live streams on YouTube pretty much every day. I watch from time to time. When Hims comes up, it's clear you know a ton about the company. As we have already said, you know a ton about healthcare, but you know specifically a ton about Hims as well. So to kick things off, why is Hims on your radar? What's interesting about the stock and the company to you?
Yeah, so part of what I do online is I try to accommodate my viewers, and they're always asking about Hims. So if I'm going to live stream and help people out and look at stocks that people are interested in, I want to look at the stocks that people are asking about. I don't want to look at some cement company in Brazil. If people want to know about Hims, then we'll look at Hims. And of course, sometimes I will look at a cement company in Brazil, but I try to help people look at the stocks they care about. And a lot of times, retail investors tend to get things wrong. When you see a lot of people that want to see some stock work, and they're in it for all the wrong reasons or whatever it is. Hims is kind of the opposite of that. It's got a big retail following, but it's also got a big institutional following, and it's just such a tremendous company. So I only knew the company really from advertising and from just them being sort of a hot startup. And when the CEO made some comments that were controversial, that sort of got on my radar too. And I was actually Andrew seems like one of the best CEOs out there right now, but we probably would not, share a lot of the same political opinions and things like that. But that doesn't mean anything to me when I'm picking stocks. So that's kind of how it got on my radar. And it's been just a fascinating company. It's got a lot of layers to it and a lot of depth, and it's kind of one of these companies that would probably is getting really misunderstood, both on the institutional level and the retail level. And it's one of my favorite kinds of examples of a company that is really hard to value for most people because of stuff we'll sort of get into and talk about. But it's deceptively difficult to understand what's going to happen to Hims over the next 5 to 10 years, and it would trip up almost any even professional investor, I think.
Yeah, so I think we'll definitely get into some of the misunderstandings. Hopefully we can touch on valuation and how you think through that. Maybe just to start off, there's been this idea circulating online that Hims is going to be the Netflix of healthcare. There's an article in Sherwood, I think that's Robinhood's media subsidiary, that used that moniker, Netflix of healthcare. Even Andrew, in the interview that we had with him, referenced Hims wanting to be, and eventually, if you look 5-10 years down the line, becoming the Netflix of healthcare. The proper way to view this business is not to obsess about any single product, say GLP-1s, but to view it as a healthcare platform. What do you think about this analogy? Do you think it holds up?
Yeah, I mean, Netflix is the first thing when I heard that was that's a tall task. But in general, I think that's right. I mean, we'll do baby steps first. Netflix is probably like the last step. But it's what is it, 400 billion market cap or something like that. But baby steps is, just get to 40 billion. That's not a baby step. That's a big win. So, basically, I mean, my view of this is it is very hard to build a large company. I've done it. I built $1 billion publicly traded company. So I feel a lot of kinship with Andrew. He started the company in 2017, and he took it public in 2020. That's like very much almost exactly the same thing that I did. But he, just a couple of years later, he was a young guy. And like I said, it's not easy to do that. Everyone wants to do that. Every single kid out of Wharton wants to start a company, take it public, and be successful. It's a 1 in a million because it is so freaking hard. And I think that the growth of Hims, specifically on the revenue side, is really suggestive of a special company. I always like to tell people that if a company has a second derivative of revenue growing, it's a very odd and unusual phenomenon. So Google was an example. I remember the Google IPO. People weren't that excited about Google, by the way. People were excited, but it wasn't IPOing at a 200 billion market cap. It was IPOing at a 20 billion market cap or 40 billion. I forget exactly. But what was weird about the revenue was that as the company got bigger, the revenue growth didn't slow. It actually got a little bit faster, which sort of defies logic because, as you incrementally add salespeople or as you get scale, your revenue growth should slow down. It shouldn't just, sort of keep going up. So the second derivative revenue is also very, very positive for Hims. And it's also positive for Palantir, which is why Palantir sort of done what it's done. It's really hard to find companies that are actually growing faster every quarter over quarter every year. And as you guys know, I'm a big short seller. In fact, I've made, just insane amounts of money short selling. And that's my shtick, really. What people know me for, at least on the trading side, is I love to short biotechs, tech stocks as well. I've got big short in the quantum computing space right now. So I'm not a fool or a Pollyanna. I'm very easy and quick to turn it around and short sell. But I think that this kind of growth is suggestive of a company that hasn't even sort of touched its addressable sort of space. So I do think that the founder-led company is one of the most powerful things in the world. He's sort of still a kid in some ways, and to be able to sort of grow into that and succeed at this level, it takes a special kind of person because it kind of reminds me of Mark Zuckerberg. Zuckerberg was sort of a fish out of water being a CEO. Really hard to just become a CEO of a growing company, but he pulled it off, and he sort of navigated himself into a way where he could be the CEO of a publicly traded company. He could grow it. He could focus on strategy. And this market is as big as it gets. Healthcare is, everybody knows, multi-trillion-dollar market. It's got a lot of inefficiencies. You talked a little bit about Daraprim. There's enormous inefficiencies in healthcare. Some people seek to exploit them. Some people seek to reduce them. Some people, just sort of operate in the space in a very inefficient way. So to me, I'm super impressed by the company's ability to grow faster over time. I know the GLP space like the back of my hand because I am the pharma bro, but I think that there is something bigger here, a lot bigger than GLPs. I think to me, it's just it's just a fantastic company that's executing really well, and the valuation is really exciting. And that's kind of where I think people will get into that if you'd like, but kind of what I'm saying in a roundabout way is when you look at the Googles and Palantirs, a lot of people think about price to sales or something like that. And it's just absolutely wrong way to look at it. And, when Google went public, there was a hedge fund. I worked at a tiger cub called Intrepid, and there was another tiger cub called Lone Pine. And Lone Pine bought almost all of the Google shares in the IPO. It was bizarre. They became the second largest shareholder of Google. And I think the largest institution, maybe Fidelity or like Vanguard or BlackRock had more. But this was a really big bet for Lone Pine. And they saw something in Google that nobody else could figure out. So this was 2006 or something, 2004 or 5, 6. And when a company like that is growing 30, 40% a year the second derivative is growing, and their TAM, they've only taken a small, tiny bit of the TAM. You basically have to throw a lot of the valuation stuff out of the window and fast forward a few years and say, or let's say they got, in Google's case, they got all the TAM, but let's say they got a lot more of the TAM than maybe, they have now. Maybe several fold or several logs in Google's case. From 1% to 80 or 90%. Hims, if you assume they do something like that, I mean, their earnings potential for the company is just insane. I mean, I think they can earn $5, $10 a share in earnings, which, you don't have to be Warren Buffett to know that's, a really, really cheap stock. And if you focus on today, well, it's important that they execute today. They have to have good quarters. They have to take one step in front of the other. But the company has that rare combination of vision and execution. And when the company announced its recent quarter, I thought this was a great time to buy because I think the GLP situation is. Well, I'm curious what you guys think, because in some ways I think it's transitory, and in other ways I think it's obviously some trend they want to sort of exploit on the compounding side. And then finally, to me, at the very least, it shows that you're a management team that's really hungry to create shareholder value, which you always love to see. And that whether or not they hit the home run with GLP, it just sort of doesn't matter because they're that hungry to create shareholder value. They're going to hit the home run on something. And they're already hitting home runs with their revenue growth.
Martin, I think in some ways you kind of touched on the question I was going to ask you, so I'm going to do an audible here and shift my question a little bit. I was going to ask you about management, and you can come back to that. I mean, specifically, I think the question I was going to ask you would be, you've been in that space, what would you potentially do differently? But instead, you can still come back to that. I'm going to touch on something you were just talking about instead. You mentioned Google. I'm not sure how many of our listeners know that history. Certainly know it better than I do, but I remember a little piece of it which might be relevant to this story. There was another company, we're talking more than 20 years ago, called Overture. I'm not sure if you remember it.
Of course, yeah.
Okay. They were kind of in the same space. I almost kind of view them as the Yahoo of advertising at that time, in the sense that it wasn't really automated to my memory, but they were doing this placement of the same kinds of text-based ads. Google came along and ate their lunch. I mean, they just completely stole it away from them. And I don't even know what happened to Overture, if they got bought up or whatever, but it was just gone. So to me, since we were just talking about Google, in that history, you got two companies. One was sort of an innovator. Google, I don't know if it may have been around longer, but Google seemed like the late comer to the advertising space and then just swamped Overture. So what about Hims? Hims might be seen as an early mover, very successful. You got others out there like Amazon. There could be other players that don't even exist or not even on our radar screen right now that could completely swamp them the same way that Overture was swamped by Google. And if you feel like wrapping in there your experience personally as an innovator and someone who's worked in this space, where do you place Hims in that story? Is Hims necessarily the innovator that's going to swamp others? Maybe that's what we're hoping for. But what is the danger that the opposite is the case?
Yeah, no, this is sort of the $64 billion question. I mean, we can't, as investors, we can't always see the future. And even somebody who spent a lot of time in pharmacy and in, that space, which, I'm more in pharmaceuticals than pharmacy. One guy, if you guys haven't talked to him yet, is the founder of PillPack, would be a really great person to talk to. It sounds like maybe you have.
They got bought by Amazon, right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah, he's a friend and somebody who's I would say literal genius in this space. He was the only guy I put up there with Andrew, and I'm sure he'd come on. But
I'm seeing TJ Parker, Elliot Cohen.
Yeah,
you recommend TJ?
Yeah,
okay. I'll reach out. Cool.
And so I think as investors, one of the hardest things to do is to predict the future. And the reason I tell the Lone Pine story, which is really like Wall Street inside baseball or hedge fund inside baseball, is that a lot of the times, like all the models, all the forecasts we do, all the customers we talk to, all the stuff we look at near term, all those tools fail us because we have to sort of look at the entrepreneur, trust in them. We give them the capital. In this case, we're secondary shareholders, but they've already raised their capital. And we just sort of watch them work. And I feel like Hims is one of those kinds of companies where, I can make lots of elaborate forecasts, but do I know what Andrew's going to do this year or next year or the year after? Of course not. It seems to me that he's executing like a madman, right? This is a company that, what really shocked me, I forget, somebody was, my chat rooms are always full of people talking smack, but somebody was talking smack about it and said, you got to avoid this stock. And I said, in 2019, these guys did 83 million in revenue. Okay. And last year they did 1.5 billion. Have you, I said to that person, have you ever done anything that comes close to that? Like, I don't know if there are any companies that in the last 5 or 6 years have had a 20x increase in revenue. And it's just such a remarkable and phenomenal win. In terms of competitors and stuff like that, it's almost like sometimes we want to find a way to create a new industry. And I think for the longest time in Silicon Valley, when you talk to the A16Zs or the founders funds or the Sequoias, these guys have tried so hard. And a lot of these guys, I think, invested in Hims originally. By the way, great hedge fund called great VC fund called 8VC. Is the co-founder of, you might want to get him on as well. He's the co-founder of Palantir. They were an early Hims investor when it was private. And
you didn't know Joe Lonsdale, right?
Yeah.
You didn't know Joe invested in Hims.
Yeah.
We'll have to reach out to him.
Yeah, and Joe's about as good of an investor as anybody. I don't think you could beat his track record. And I guess the point I'm making is the Silicon Valley has tried for the last 10 years, longer than that probably, but especially the last 5 or 10 years, they've tried to say, how do we point tech at healthcare? How do we point software at healthcare? And nobody has made it work. There have been so many disasters, write-downs, things like that. And, this is one company that's actually made it work, and it's working. Now, if I were Andrew, the world is your oyster here, and kind of what not to do is probably the hardest, thing to work on, because all of healthcare is broken. There are a lot of reasons behind that, but, he hasn't gotten into telehealth as far as I know, which is a space that's attracted a lot of people. Sort of wellness management is another space that's attracted a lot of people. And he sort of has executed in a space that's actually generating cash flow.
By telehealth, you mean like primary care?
Connecting you to a doctor over video chat, the teledoc, sort of type of experience. And, I think he's navigated to a place where, look, the guy's got 80% gross margins. That's a software company, right? The rest of these companies that have wanted to do this, what they end up finding is that they're a healthcare services company. And you don't want to be a healthcare services company if you can help it, because you're going to have 10%, 15% gross margins. So I'm really impressed with Andrew's ability to sort of find a way to apply technology to healthcare, which, just look at the revenue growth. Like I said, 80 million to, it'll be what, two or so billion this year. I think 2.4, but I don't want to set a bar higher for anyone else. I think the street's at 2.2 or something. How do you grow that fast? It's because the market is begging for tools. It's not because, look, as much as I like Andrew, you don't grow from 80 million in revenue to 2 billion by accident. Part of it is, of course, their execution, but part of it is the customers are begging you for something. There's something happening where they want to give you their money. It's hard to sell product. Our startup's starting to do very well, but before we focused on financial software, we tried a couple different things, and it was impossible to get customers. We're now sort of solving a need some people have, so customers are sort of throwing their money at us, and it's two very different feelings. And some people call it PMF, but he's clearly hit on something that is growing like a weed. And I think that as he tries to expand around that, it'll be curious and interesting to see what pockets of healthcare he's going to focus on, because it is a $3 trillion business just in the US, and a huge chunk of it is broken. We saw Walgreens getting taken over for a value that's arguably kind of less than Hims was a few months ago. So, you have, a chance to be as big as a CVS or even a UnitedHealthcare. What does UnitedHealthcare do that's so special that they're worth 400 billion? If you think about, it's a great company, but if you think about UnitedHealthcare, they're not an insurance company, so it's not the capital. A lot of people sort of think about health insurance and say, well, an insurer has to take the risk in case I get hit by a car. And if I get hit by a car and I need this complicated surgery, it's $3 million and I have to pay for it. But that's not what United Healthcare is doing. They're sort of a pass-through mechanism. And that's why health insurance got rebranded to managed care. And managed care is something that's, a very different process, where basically they take your health costs and they add 10 or 15% to it. And when I raised prices on drugs, Daraprim was the one I was well known for. And I did this all with the double interest of course, growing my revenue and growing my cash flow as a publicly traded company. But also there were situations where it actually would help the patient. And I won't go into that in great detail, but I never once had an insurer say no. Never once. I never once had an insurer say, hold on, why do we need to raise the price here? And the reason for that is you can't grow volume as an insurance company or a managed care company, because there's only 300 million people in the US and they're divvied up amongst 5 insurance companies. So they're not going to be more people. So everyone's got a plan. The only way you can grow your earnings is if the cost grows. It's kind of like a defense company like Lockheed or Boeing. They are incentivized to spend as much money as possible. And that's why we've had this runaway spending, because they get 10% of that. If Lockheed can deliver a new fancy jet plane for $50 million or $200 million, well, they make 10%. So they'd rather deliver for $200 million. So when I raise the prices of these drugs, the insurance companies are saying, let's go, Martin. All right, keep it coming. Because next year we get to charge even more premiums. And we know we're not going to get more people. So the only way we can really grow is our margin on premiums. So there's a broken system there. And if you think about the value that UNH extracts at $400 billion market cap, and they do provide a service. They help doctors who want to treat patients have a network where they can almost get a guaranteed payment. So if Hims, this is just a random example, but if Hims points their machinery at that, their ability to execute and succeed, then they can get a piece of that market. The reason I say this is far afield from what Hims does today, but if you look at this space, sort of the digital pharmacy space, there have been thousands of companies that have tried to do this. In my Rolodex, I have like 600 people that have tried to do this. I even did an appearance for one, which was funny. They begged me, Martin, can you come to our launch party? And, everyone and their brother wants to start an online pharmacy. But Hims has executed. And when people say that in my chat room, they say, well, Hims has no moat. I said, well, it appears their customers love their product. So that's kind of the moat. If your customers, Walmart has no moat. You go start your own convenience store tomorrow. So let me know how it goes. It's not that easy. Getting sourcing right, getting pricing right, getting branding right, getting all those things right is something Hims has been able to do. So I think the next time they point their, I call it machinery, but their expertise, their organization at some target in healthcare, I think that, it's just going to be another like 10x opportunity where you could see the company have 10 billion in revenue. And I'm sure they have a plan to do it, but you and I are not necessarily get that plan. As investors, we got to keep our ear as close to the ground as possible, watch their job postings, do everything we can to sort of get an inkling of what's next. But management is ultimately the bet, I think, in so many ways. And as a fundamental value investor, I like to look at numbers and crunch them all day, but sometimes you do have to sort of take some faith that the management's going to do the right thing. They've certainly done it so far.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly the right long-term view. If we talk about like the short or even medium term, the stock has had, countless 10% swings, at times 15, 20% swings on a single day. because of GLP-1s. And this is a space that you said, well, it's something that we wanted to get into. GLP-1s on track to become, one of the largest consumer products in the history of healthcare. Hims now has a slice, although that slice is sort of in doubt as a result of the FDA ending the shortage, right? So people are wondering how Hims is going to approach this new landscape. I guess, what do you think about GLP-1s? How do you think Hims fits in? Do you think the market is right to sort of throw Hims around 10 to 20% every time there's news? What do you make of all this?
We'll take the last one first, and then we'll get into the deep discussion. But I think when I see big swings like that, I think it's a bullish thing, because it basically means that the future of this company is something that shareholders and traders don't understand, and that they're wildly different opinions on what this company can become, and it changes on day to day. When market participants are all in like strict agreement on something, yeah, I don't know that you want to be in a stock like that. You kind of want to be in a stock where market participants are saying, gee, I think this is a 10x. And the other guy says, I think this is a disaster. And someone's going to be right, and you hope it's you. So I don't mind the swings. I kind of think they're almost suggestive of success. You don't
certainly good for Hims house, I'll say.
And you don't want to be on the receiving end of the downswing, obviously. But it also gives an opportunity for people who trade a little bit to get back in the stock, or, lighten their load a little bit when it gets up there, because you might get a chance to buy again. So I'm sure it makes some people some money, or, you get to dollar cost average, maybe a little better. GLPs. So I remember the first GLP in 2000 when Amylin was publicly traded as AMLN, and they found the Gila monster venom. They realized there was a paralog to a human gut hormone that we previously didn't know what it did. And exenatide was born. Exenatide was a big part of my early hedge fund career. This is a drug that got FDA approved as Byetta. And I thought Byetta would not do well. And I was mostly right. But what happened after that was Byetta was Amylin's drug and Lilly's drug. And then Lilly curiously kicked Byetta to the curb. And I thought it was very odd. And I actually thought it was bad for Lilly, because you try not to partner with a company and then de-partner with them. It's kind of a weird thing to do. But Lilly had their own GLP. And again, from my perspective, I was sitting there saying, how would I feel if I started a drug company and I partnered with Lilly to have them help sell my drug? And then Lilly says, actually, we don't need you guys. We have our own version that's better. I'd be pretty pissed off that they didn't tell me that, or that they sort of decided that. So anyway, Lilly comes along with Trulicity, and Trulicity, so Byetta does around $1 billion in revenue, and Trulicity ends up doing $4 billion. All the while, of course, Novo Nordisk is sitting there making Victoza, the precursor to semaglutide, and Victoza's fine. Liraglutide, it's selling well, and it's sort of better than Byetta, but Trulicity was amazing. And of course, Novo has to one up Trulicity, and they come out with Ozempic, and the rest is history. And now we're on sort of the next wave of GLPs. So the idea of one of my overarching theories in pharmaceuticals, which I think is borne out to be true, but will continue to be borne out to be true, is we had this big wave in the 90s where we could create medicines, largely small molecules, and the Pfizer's, Merck's, Bristol Myers, and so forth created this armamentarium of medicines that are now generic. When a drug goes generic, it's sort of now available for free for everyone. It's not quite free, but the Indian and Chinese companies, and some American, some others, that make these generics make them for pennies, and they cost very little to make. And so drug prices will go from hundreds of dollars potentially for a pill to pennies per pill, and that's one of the features, if you can call it that, in pharmaceuticals. It's also one of the reasons Warren Buffett has never invested in a pharmaceutical company, is because you can build this great product and then it's just going to disappear someday. You have an expiry date and you got to start all over. Could you imagine if Coca-Cola or American Express, they said, well, on 2020, your business is done. 2032, on this date, your business is over. You got to come up with a new soft drink. It'd be terrible. But that's how the pharmaceutical business is. And the resulting situation that we're in from that is that we've had decades of sophisticated drug development that has resulted in this, there's no other word to call it. I mean, cornucopia, armamentarium of generic drugs, where interestingly, we have so many great generic drugs that we actually don't need that many new pharmaceuticals. And that's not great for the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah.
Because if you think about cardiovascular disease, my father passed away from cardiovascular disease a few years ago. There is not a lot of room to create a new blood pressure medicine or new lipid medicine. We have everything we need. And if you look at even diabetes, we have about 10, 12 different ways to lower type 2 diabetes with hemoglobin A1C. So developing a brand new diabetes drug is not in one's best interest. Bristol Myers canceled a bunch of theirs, for example. Oncology is even starting to get to a point where, of course, there's still big unmet needs there, but many of the diseases that used to have a 1-year overall survival now have a 5-year overall survival. And so we're starting to reach the end of medicine, if that makes sense. And I think that, we still have a lot of diseases that need treatment. And I get mad at the longevity folks because a lot of my investors are longevity guys. I want to live forever and stuff like that. Every Silicon Valley billionaire wants to live forever. But the reality is we still have kids dying of Duchenne muscular dystrophy, older people who get sick from Alzheimer's. So there's still challenges in medicine that we want to solve. But inevitably, in another generation or two, it's hard for me to fathom what diseases to go after. Sorry for that long soliloquy, but it makes you wonder if the value of pharmaceuticals, the market cap of all the pharmaceutical companies is a few trillion. Where's that value going to go? Because if there's nothing less to treat, the drug companies sort of will probably give their value to the delivery companies and the software companies that are thinking about how do we deliver drugs better. My father didn't die because, and again, my father lived to a very nice old age and he went out the way he wanted, but my father didn't pass away because there weren't drugs for him. My father passed away because all the other stuff in the healthcare system, where getting to a doctor, getting your prescription, making it easy, that stuff's not that easy for everyone. And that value will probably accrue more incrementally to the services and software companies than the drug companies. GLP is almost a cosmeceutical. And I hate to say that because it's serious medicine too. And the word cosmeceutical doesn't necessarily have to be a pejorative. I think that there are drugs that if they improve your quality of life, then, there's nothing wrong with that. I think there's some people at the FDA that kind of say, is this a disease? Is being fat a disease? It's in general, actually, often, depending on how you look at it, you could say yes and you can say no. And I think we're going to see more things like this where drug companies say, look, I can't make another drug for cardiovascular disease. I can't make another drug for urology. There's nothing left to treat. Why don't I make a drug for baldness? And the pharma industry can make any drug we put our minds to with enough research and enough effort. But where's the money? And where's the interest? And where's the need? And baldness is not the kind of thing I think the average Merck or Eli Lilly wants to make their money on. But at some point, there's nothing left. Now, GLPs happen to be one of these things that, they were just kind of rinky-dink, ho-hum type 2 drugs. And they're competing with DPP-4 inhibitors, which are pills that lower glycemia as well, but they didn't lower weight loss. So the GLPs have this super weight loss lowering ability, almost to the point where it's too much with third generation GLPs like retatrutide from Eli Lilly and others. So, the new era of pharmaceuticals may dictate that we need drugs like GLPs to substantiate our growth. Eli Lilly is the biggest drug company in the world. For the longest time, it was like the 10th biggest drug company in the world. And Eli Lilly is going to sell more GLP than Merck's going to sell Keytruda. And Keytruda saves a lot of lives, cancer patients. So is the world fair that, maybe Merck should be getting paid more because they're saving cancer patients' lives? And some of the impact of GLPs are coming from a cosmeceutical perspective. Now, the biggest question here, in the elephant in the room, is about intellectual property rights and kind of thinking about how should reward be distributed? This is sort of what I'm touching on the whole idea of like Keytruda versus GLPs. how should reward be distributed and what's going to happen next? Well, one of the reasons I look at Novo Nordisk stock very carefully, and it's attractive because it's very cheap. Ozempic grew 30% year over year last quarter. A lot of people are saying, well, it's over. Lilly's drugs are better and Ozempic is toast. 30% year over year growth for a company that size is really, really impressive. Ozempic's not done yet, but the Ozempic patent is coming up for expiry soon. And this is a really big opportunity if Hims plays its cards right, because one of the hardest things to do is to make Ozempic. It is rather difficult to make, but
When you real quick, when you say coming up for expiry, isn't it like 2031 in the US?
it depends on who you ask. Almost everyone believes that 2031 is the time.
Now, Canada is 2026.
Yep.
And of course it differs across Europe, but
Yeah.
I thought 2031 was the date.
It is 2031. The 343 patent expires in 2031, but there's the 122 patent, which expires in 26. And if Ozempic was a small molecule, all the generic companies would be trying to hit the 2026 date. The problem is nobody's got the capacity to actually make the generic. You need a massive amount of capacity because it's made recombinantly. So you even if you could beat the 2026 patent, which claims it's kind of a genus versus species claim, it claims a broader group of acylated GLP-1s, whereas the 2031 patent you mentioned claims the specific instantiation of a class. So genus versus species, and this is a common theme in pharma patents. But even if you assume 2031, which is fine, who has the capacity to make this stuff? It's hard to make drugs. It's hard to make biological drugs. Pills would be very easy, but it's actually made as biologic in a living system. So those vats and those bioreactors, they cost billions of dollars to make. But if you want to be the first company out the door in 2031, which isn't that far away, there's an opportunity for Hims. If you want to be there faster, there's also an opportunity. That's sort of a longer and separate discussion. But I think that is something that, absolutely could be an enormous catalyst for Hims. But getting to the IP and compounding, as a pharma guy, I'm not a big fan of compounding. But I also acknowledge, and if we want to take a break and talk about patents for one more time, we can. But I do want to mention one last thing. Mylan is one of the biggest generic companies in the US. They're now called Viatris. They merged with a division of Pfizer. But when Novo made liraglutide, they also patented semaglutide. So this is what Mylan claims. And the liraglutide patent is long expired. It's the 343 patent. So if Hims wanted to go and take a big risk, you could do something in pharma called an at-risk generic launch. And at-risk launches aren't that crazy because the worst case is that you have to pay back the profits you made. There is a concept of treble damages if there's willful infringement, but that's rarely given. And I think that, as long as you paper up the idea that, look, we don't think we're infringing willfully, we think that this claim already existed. How many times can you patent GLP-1? How many times can you take the same native molecule that's in our bodies that first discovered in the 90s, late 90s, by a random guy, actually. It's a longer story. But, we've known about this thing for 25 years. How many patents do you want to get on it? How many times are we going to issue the same patent over and over again? And some people might say that the problem with our system is stuff like this, where, you can kind of patent the same invention over and over and over again. But again, manufacturing capacity is probably one of the harder challenges here, more than anything else. Compounding to me is a little scary. I think that in some ways, I'm for the innovator who gets the patent and says, how are you making my drug? I have a patent on this. You're not allowed to do that. I sympathize with that. And if you stop having intellectual property rights, you stop having drugs. So I'm kind of, sort of torn here because there are a lot of people that want access to GLPs and can afford it. So to me, it's a really hard call to make. I sort of tend to fall on the side of the innovator, but I also feel like, at some point, GLP-1s are not, that sort of special, and getting a patent on new one and new one and new one, at some point we'll sort of go back to that place where there's not going to be any improvements you could really make to GLPs that would actually be useful to the consumer.
So I would love to play off that. Now, first, I should say, you've been excellent at anticipating where our questions are going. So I keep having to change my questions up based upon because you've already answered my question. So let me play off a little bit off of what you just said on two related things. This question was going to be about the future of big pharma and compounding, and maybe a little side reference to intellectual property and trademarks. So we can still come back to those topics, but I'll hone these questions down a little bit more than that. In the short term, it was really interesting to hear the piece you just said about, was semaglutide, really new? What date are we really talking about? Because one of the fascinating things in the Discord that's been chatted about a lot, there's this assumption, and this is a very short-term question, but there's a long-term piece of this too. In the short term, the question is, well, one of the bear theses right here is that, okay, as soon as these FDA deadlines are behind us, we're going to see Novo come and throw a patent infringement case right at Hims and take them down, because the FDA may have jurisdiction when it comes to Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, but patents are a different thing, and Hims is vulnerable there. And yet, we haven't actually seen that happen yet.
Novo's got
And
bigger fish to fry. I mean, they're not.
well, so one of the things I've been wondering about, and I wrote an analysis of this, was, okay, in theory, Hims is potentially vulnerable there, and yet there are a lot of ways to defend against patent suits, one of which is the one you mentioned. And I've been speculating, perhaps not quite as publicly on this, that maybe we won't see
I get
that lawsuit after all, even though all the bears are saying it's coming. But before you answer that question in the short term, there's a long-term piece, and then you can answer at length, either one. You were talking a little bit about the long term, kind of when you in this. I would say, I'm not sure I would totally agree, but you have more expertise than me, so I'm gonna have some humility here. I'm not sure I would say all of our medical problems have been solved so that there's no new drugs that can be put together. I mean, cancer's still out
We're not
there.
there yet. No.
There's plenty of things, and longevity, people are trying to figure out how we can live to forever. I hope they get that one figured out, because I'm a little older than most of you guys. But there's still plenty that can be done in the innovation space. I don't understand how this works, but I'm hearing that they can use AI to like short circuit and really speed up drug development. I have no clue how that works. On the other hand, that's not the business that Hims is in. I actually asked Dudum some version of this question, is like, what do you want to get, what can we do in terms of potentially really integrating into what sort of some of these spin-off things are, in terms of, I mean, I'm not sure I said this part to Dudum directly, but I've definitely said it to Jonathan. I said, there's only so many platforms that are likely to be out there. Maybe let's imagine 2 or 3, 5 years from now, you got 2 or 3 big players. Hims is one of them. Maybe there's a few others that are really platforms that have, and Hims maybe has 4 million or 8 million or some kind of number. At that point, the leverage seems to potentially change, that you've got pharma companies and maybe medical device makers who are looking for the folks who can actually deliver customers to them. And at some point, the leverage changes from Hims being this small time player in this minnow in this sea of big time pharma companies, to being the platform that delivers access to customers, and the leverage potentially changes. So you got a short-term question, which is around, an adversarial relationship between, say, Novo Nordisk and Hims, or other compounders. But you've got this longer term where they're potentially working in synergy together. So how do those things come together, given that you've worked in all these industries and seen it all work out?
Yeah, no, this is awesome stuff. So if I'm Lilly or Novo, I don't sue Hims. I know most of these big pharma CEOs. One, it's not going to change your market cap. This thing's gonna be, you'll spend 20 million on legal fees, they'll spend 20 million, nothing's gonna happen. And you're gonna piss off some people. And those people are your customers,
Yeah.
and
True.
people who want to be your customers. So I would not be picking on Hims because it sort of looks bad. And no harm, listen, if you lost half your revenue, I mean, I would file a lawsuit right away. But last quarter, Novo grew 30%, Lilly grew 1,000,000%. There's no real reason to do it.
I will say, in the Novo transcript, they did say they're keeping an eye on the compounders.
It's really not something that I see either company pursuing, because
How does this turn into synergy? As opposed, right now, it might be adversarial. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. How does it become synergy?
So I started one of the companies that I started, I mentioned earlier, and just how hard it is to how miraculous the Hims story is. I started a one software company. One of the products we started was sort of an AI doctor, and I was sort of very early to the AI trend. I even had a small AI company in 2015. And my life partner, is a woman who was one of the first people at OpenAI. And so we talk about AI, and we talk about healthcare and AI all the time. And in fact, Demis, the CEO of DeepMind, the Google AI unit, was on 60 Minutes the other day talking about the end of medicine and how AI is going to solve all these problems. Of course, if you've ever actually made a medicine, which I have a plethora of that plaque over there, and many others, or U.S. patents I've won for making medicines from scratch, I don't think AI is going to be too useful there. But I do think that this care coordination problem we have, which is the lion's share of that $3 trillion, is just getting the trains to run on time and the pieces to fit. Drugs are not, I would even think of as a part of that, because drugs actually save money. GLP is cost effective because it stops even more expensive stuff down the road from happening. When you take a Lipitor, you're saving an enormous amount of money for the healthcare system. If you don't take the Lipitor, the coronary artery bypass graft surgery is going to cost, roughly $1 million. So taking the Lipitor for 10 cents is a pretty good investment for the system. And it's a really good investment for somebody to pay for it. One of the dirty secrets of the generics world that I think a lot of people know is that when CVS gets your generic, the health insurance or managed care company it's actually $0 from them, but CVS will charge you sort of a processing fee, and they're getting the generic for a lot less. It's like a 50 to 80% margin. They're getting that. They're really excited about that margin. In fact, if you look at the consumer stuff that they sell in the pharmacy, pretty much 95% of the volume of the pharmacy by space, that stuff is a razor thin margin. And when they fill a brand name prescription, they don't make money there. They get excited when somebody comes in and they get a SSRI, blood pressure drug, a ED drug, all these drugs that are off patent, the birth control, and they charge $5 and the drugs cost $1 for them or $2 for them. It's a really high margin product. They love that. But I think Bill Gates said this recently. Of course, I think this because I started an effort around it. I've mostly abandoned that effort now. There's another company called Superhuman that's doing this. They just raised a bunch of money, and they kind of would work really well with Hims in the sense that technology will help us coordinate our care a lot better than doctors will. AI doctors are now better than human doctors.
Yeah.
I think that they're not allowed to prescribe medicine, but that'll change too. And just like self-driving cars, where at some point it's probably a liability to have a human driver, we're going to look at it the same way with medicine. And I love doctors. They do God's work. But I think we're going to have a situation where it's a liability to have a human doctor versus an AI doctor. Because let's say you're a dermatologist. There's 30 dermatology conferences every year and about 20 dermatology journals that publish every week. Is your average dermatologist reading and attending those? No, of course not. Does the average dermatologist get tired? Yes. Does the average dermatologist get cranky? Does the average dermatologist make mistakes? Computer doesn't do any of that. And we're just at the infancy of this. Imagine what's going to be like in 3 or 4 years when my girlfriend makes GPT-9 or whatever it is. And, it's just getting better and better. So to the extent that AI, and again, the superhuman app, I think it allows us, it helps coordinate like your vital signs and all kinds of tests. So it's all in one app. If HIMSS does something like that and helps, sort of coordinate the rest of, all of your care, to your point, I actually think it's a lot less about them being a vehicle for pharma, which of course they would be. But remember, 90% of drugs that are dispensed are generics. And so if it's, of course, that 10% is still really valuable. And you want a channel for that. And the more of a channel you have for that, the better. But I think it's time for something like a healthcare social network, or which kind of HIMSS kind of is. It's not the membership level, it's kind of would be, let me see here, the amount of members. It's still relatively small social network.
Couple over 2 million or something like that right now.
Maybe 3 million next year or this year, and 4 million maybe in 2 years.
Andrew says 10 million 2030. We'll see.
That's huge. Yeah. I mean, if
aspirational, but we're hoping.
So you have 10 million people, and it's 10 million people out of 330 million people who all want to be healthy. One of the last things I'll tell you it's really important thesis of mine, and I'm curious if you agree. A lot of people blamed people like me, maybe not just me, but people like me for rising healthcare costs and rising things like that. If you look at healthcare costs from 1960 to today, it has grown metronomically. As a percentage of things we spend money on, it has grown and not stopped. And that's not happened because of Martin Shkreli. It's not happened because of EpiPen. It's happening because we value health. It's the most important thing we have. It's the only good where we have infinite marginal demand for. There is a point where I have too many t-shirts. There's a point where I have too many electronics. There's no point where I have too much health. And because of that, HIMSS has an opportunity. Again, the superhuman companies got far less users. But the point is, people want to know more about their health. There's no place to get that. My former product, I wanted people to sort of use it to constantly monitor their health, constantly get access to their different sort of tools. The old CEO of ZocDoc, who's a very formidable entrepreneur himself, has something a little like this, and it's somewhat competitive with HIMSS. And I think you're touching on something really big, though, because while HIMSS only has 3 million people today, over time, there's no great place to chat about healthcare. There's no great place to say, well, finasteride worked for me, but did it work for you? And, oh, my buddy's on that, and maybe I should try it too. And it ends up being where I think more and more the doctors become less important. Physicians are very important to society, but the idea that you need a physician to take, say, a blood pressure lowering medicine. Blood pressure lowering medicines have almost no side effects. In fact, it's almost impossible, for them to have side effects. The average adult is perfectly capable, especially with the help of AI, of having their own blood pressure medicine. In fact, to put the doctor in between the patient and their medicine is actually harmful. Again, my father, for example, would gladly have taken a blood pressure medicine, but being somebody from, what's virtually a third world country, coming to America, feeling uncomfortable with the whole physician process, it limited his ability to get that. So the FDA is very reluctant to make drugs OTC, but they've done it with Claritin, which used to be prescription only. They've done it with a handful of drugs. And I would venture to say 10 to 20% of prescription drugs today could be made OTC, and it would have absolutely no impact on human healthcare. In fact, I would argue it would increase. Blood pressure medicine is very funny. You cannot overdose on it. Like it is remarkably safe, but millions of people need it, and it's proven to save lives. But we stop the patient from getting access. I was at my physician the other day, and I only tell this story because I think it's illustrative of what's happened to millions of people. I came in, I have asthma, and I showed up, and I'm heaving. He says, "What's wrong?" And I held my tongue. The old Martin Shkreli might have said this. I held my tongue and I said, "What's wrong is you didn't refill 2 of my asthma medications." We went to the pharmacy. They weren't there. They gave me a bunch of BS. And I decided, you know what? I'll see how I do without these. And what do you know? I'm half dead from an asthma attack. And I like my doc so much that I just gave him a hug and said, "What's up?" But when you have a product like Hims, you could actually improve healthcare outcomes because you get out of that sort of insane morass of refills and all this stuff that is in the way of the system that's based on these traditional sort of values. Now, in the old days, well, I would say this: an oncologist wants to prescribe chemotherapy. I don't think you should be able to get that from Hims. But I think that, needless to say, but I think low impact medicines like birth control and things like that, I don't see why we need, any kind of physician. And obviously, the fact that we're letting people teleprescribe and things like that, it's obvious that even the powers that be agree that a lot more drugs should sort of just be OTC. There is a sort of resistance to that in DC for whatever reason, and I think part of it is the doctor lobby. A lot of people make me the bad guy, but I actually point fingers at a lot of times at doctors. Doctors would much rather you come in for the visit and get the prescription and get the refill, and their practice is booming, than to say, okay, you should take you should take this blood pressure medicine, or you should take this birth control. You know,
Let's use that. Let's use that as a transition because I know Jonathan wanted to get in some finance world questions for you in the time we've got. So I'm going to kick it back
Well,
to Jonathan.
yeah, I noticed we're pushing up on the top of the hour here.
I love to lab. I'm sorry.
Oh no,
It's good. We like listening.
you make it extraordinarily easy on us, Martin. Question: do you have like 10 or 15 more minutes?
I have as much time as you want. This is great.
Oh wow. Okay. Cool. Well, yeah, maybe let's transition back real quickly to the investor situation. Because it is a community of 3,000 Hims investors, and let's just talk about the stock for a moment. Company, as we've touched on, company is growing revenue at a record clip. Like last, I think fourth quarter was 90% year-over-year growth.
There's no company growing that fast.
The core is growing at like 40%. Profitable with expanding free cash flow margins, gaining market share on its competitors, firing on all cylinders, right? And yet we are in a situation now where the short interest, as we touched on earlier, is close to 30%. It's like the most shorted stock on the S&P 400 mid-cap index. At the same time, the ownership of the company has transitioned from like less than 50% institutional to close to 85% institutional. If you go to Fintel, they're at like 202 million of the 220 or 230 million outstanding shares. Maybe your platform, Goodell, has those numbers as well.
I wouldn't go to Fintel.
honestly, I'm not happy with Fintel because like the numbers that I have serious problems with Fintel. I don't know that it's maintained. I don't know where they're sourcing their info.
I'd love to talk with the holders because
so like we have this institutional situation. It's like 85%. And by the way, it's like a top 5 or 10 retail name on Twitter, but retail only owns probably 5% because institutions have gobbled up 85%, right? So retail's left with like 5%.
There's a lot of love, but also a little bit of hate out there.
There's a little hate too. The question is simple. It's like, what do you make of these market dynamics? I'd say 3 pieces to the puzzle. Number 1, extremely high short interest. Number 2, high institutional ownership. Number 3, popular among retail but limited ownership.
Yeah. So I mean, I've been humbled many times in my life, and I've learned to try to be humble. But if there's one thing I think I'm very good at, it's short selling, and I think this is a terrible stock to sell short. This is I don't know why you would ever want to sell short a stock that's growing at 100%. I've never seen that be successful. But let me quickly go through the holders list. Obviously, are there changes to Hims that are negative? Yes, you could agree with. I think that's reasonable, but that in and of itself does not make a good short. I like to short stocks that are fraudulent, where like somebody's going to jail. Like, there's real issues, fundamental issues at the company. There are people lying. That's the kind of stuff I like to short. But think about it in the long term. If I told you a company started in 2017, 2019, they had 83 in revenue. 2025, they have 2.4 billion in revenue. There is no part of this that is attractive as a short. Like that's one of the greatest things ever. This is the wet dream of every Silicon Valley investor. This is the opposite of a short. Whoever created that company is probably really good at whatever they're doing, and you can probably continue to bet on them. So
what is going on then? Like, what's your hypothesis?
I think so. So the lot's changed in the hedge fund world. I'll go to that in 2 seconds on the short side. Why would somebody want to short this? I guess I could just address it right now. So hedge funds have largely morphed from when I was in them. They were mostly single manager, meaning there was some big boss who was pulling the trigger. He was the gunslinger. I worked for a great guy named Steve. Steve was super smart. He worked at Tiger and Fidelity. Investors gave us billions of dollars. Steve would ask me, what healthcare stocks do you like, or whatever it is? And I would basically beg Steve to buy a stock or sell a stock short or whatever. And he'd listen to me and say, maybe, kid, I don't know. And sometimes he'd do it and sometimes he wouldn't. And that was the Tiger Cub model. And, we had guts. We had huge guts. We did not care if the stock would double or triple while we were short. If we really felt there was fraud or some issue that's going to take the stock to $1, couldn't care less. Everything changed after GameStop, and everything changed after the emergence of what's called a multi-manager fund. So most hedge funds now are multi-manager. At 0.72, at 0.72 is sort of always multi-manager, but at 0.72, at Millennium, at Citadel, who have most of the capital in hedge funds now, there's hundreds of teams, and they all get little pieces of capital. And no one short can really take down these firms. In fact, no one portfolio. You can have a guy's portfolio completely disintegrate tomorrow, and the rest of the firm will kind of just like congeal like a blob and absorb it. So hedge funds have basically become chicken. And this means that when people short stocks these days, yeah, sometimes they're shorting because they're really comfortable and excited about a stock going to zero. But a lot of times they're trying to find companies that have temporary issues and that they can balance their long portfolio with some shorts, and they can neutralize the beta, so they have a nice, even market neutral portfolio that they're trying to make like 5 or 10% or 15% on. When I worked for Jim Cramer's hedge fund, 10% was considered a bad year. Like that was like we did something wrong. When we shorted stocks back then, we were shorting companies that had no business model. We were shorting companies that were just outright fraudulent. We were buying companies that had great prospects, and we would return 30%, 40%. The hedge fund I went to, Steve's firm, we were up 100-something% in 2000. So these days, hedge funds gear for these really tiny returns. They're really nervous about shorting after GameStop blew up a hedge fund. They don't want to be in anything that's too risky or too crazy. So this is sort of a safe, quote unquote, short, because, a big chunk of the revenue is going to go away. How are shareholders going to react to that? And so much of hedge funds is so short term. This is why I really enjoyed working for the Tiger complex, because Tiger took a very long term view on these things. If you thought, like I said, Lone Pine was sort of the seminal Tiger Cub, they were willing to own Google for almost a decade. Hedge funds are measured by monthly returns, and the amount of capital you can manage at a Citadel or at a Millennium, which are fantastic firms. If you're working there as one of 300 portfolio managers and your monthly returns start to drop, they'll take capital away from you. So you can't form these really long-term things. You have to think about what's going to happen tomorrow. And if you're sitting in that seat, I think you would even appreciate and respect that you might short Hims, because you're sitting there saying, okay, I'm managing $1 billion. I need to be up this month. I don't care about next month. I'll worry about that then. I have to be up between, April 1st and April 30th. And then everything starts again on May 1st. And I have to find a stock where the fundamentals are going, there's the first derivative is negative. Here's a company called Hims. It's a high growth company. One of their key pillars of growth is going away. That sounds like a short. Of course, it's not a good short because the rest of the company's still growing.
I would love to bounce what I think the short thesis is off of you.
Oh, yeah,
Have you
sure.
handle that?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So for the record, I believe that both Jonathan and I are both bulls. So let's put that out there. I think everyone knows that.
For the
Who's
record, we
tracking.
own Hims.
Yes, we are positive, but nevertheless, we hear the naysayers, and it was really interesting to listen to what you were just saying because these folks are being judged, based on how they're doing in short period. Hims, you talked about GameStop. Hims got a short squeeze just a few weeks ago. It shot up. I don't know, remember what the top was, $70, maybe with some high number like that. It came back down. I'm thinking, well, folks surely must have learned their lesson from that one, but apparently not because we're still looking at 30% plus right now, which means it could happen again. And yet it's still there. But that said, off the top of my head, here are some of the things that are being tossed out there. One of which speaks to a question I was going to ask you anyway, so we'll throw it in there. So first of all, you've got litigation risk. People who seem to think that that Hims its core business must be slowing down. That they're losing so much to churn that their growth is really just going to drop off from that 70-80% to 50% to now going down to 20%, which is supposed to be the industry, and then even lower than that, flattening at some point. If you're losing customers on the back end due to churn at the same rate as you're bringing them in on the front end, then your growth is zero. And so allegedly, this is not what management said, not specifically not what Andrew Judum said when we actually asked him about this topic, but allegedly the core is slowing down. And the only thing keeping the company afloat is GLP-1s, and that is legally questionable, and they're going to get slammed by Novo Nordisk. Then, and this actually speaks to the other question I was actually going to ask you about. I've literally had these folks point this stuff out to us. There's allegedly a whole bunch of insider selling, which is signs that even the insiders know it. Now, if you actually look at the data, Andrew Judum himself has sold a little bit, but he still holds basically a vast majority of his shares.
I went through the data this morning. He's sold almost nothing. Like he has exactly what he had.
But there are some lower level staff, lower level, they're not lower, but they're lower than Andrew, who have sold some of a good portion of their shares. So you put all this thesis together, and allegedly, and I've heard this from others who know many of these players that same kinds of folks who've said they kind of expect things to just kind of hit hard within a matter of like now to a few weeks from now,
Right.
especially with the litigation risk hitting. And then of course there's always the folks like Amazon who are out there ready apparently to eat their lunch, although it hasn't happened yet. Speaking of
terrible
pack.
It's like,
So
first of all,
I've just painted a negative, potentially short thesis that might explain this 30% that's out there. Even doing my best, and I'm sure there are others who were genuine bears out there who could do a better job than I did. I mean, what do you make of this?
I would fire any analyst that came to me with that short thesis. Like,
Okay.
insider sales are normal. Like, these people worked hard at this company to build a company for 7 years. They have their entire net worth in it. They can sell. It's okay. It's not the end of the world. I remember Celgene was an old jar company. I remember when there were some insider sales on Celgene, and I was younger and knew a little less. And I was sitting there. I was annoyed because I was long the stock. It was a 40 bagger. It's just one of these things where, insiders can sell for all kinds of reasons. Now, look, if the CEO sells every share he has tomorrow, you got to ask him what the heck's going on. But, barring that, I as an entrepreneur, when I had the CFO, Mark, nice guy, wasn't the most, CFO was a bit of an aspirational job for him. But he became the CFO, and another guy, CMO, who was wonderful, and Mark's wonderful too. But when these guys got their stock options from me, and they said, Martin, my options are worth like $3 million. And I just lost $3 million on some day trader or rap album.
Right.
But I'm sitting there and I see the joy in their eyes, and I'm sitting there saying, this is the best feeling ever. Like this beats everything for me. And that's why I love being an entrepreneur, because watching these guys who, again, they're in a lot of ways, they're average Joes. They're sort of average corporate Joes, if that makes sense. And watching them say, I never thought I'd be able to cash out $3 million or $4 million. Is it okay if I sell my shares or sell some of my shares and buy a house? That is what this game is all about to me. Like watching my guys be able to do that, it is so special and so awesome. All the gals and guys that have worked for me over the years being able to cash out their stock options and be rich, that's your dream as an entrepreneur. You've changed their lives. So there's nothing wrong with that. As long as the CEO doesn't dump it all. I mean, he should be allowed to sell 5 or 10% of his holdings. So the insider stuff is just complete nonsense. Meta, the guy he sold billions of dollars of stock. Same thing with Bezos. This is nonsense. Now, on the litigation side, having run drug companies that had been against compounders, where they were serious threats, still never sued them because to most drug guys, it's a fly because you're selling so much product at such a high price that you don't really care about the compounder. And if you're growing at 30% and you look at the revenue of Hims, right? How much possible revenue could you be missing? It's a rounding error. So are you going to sue somebody over a rounding error? It doesn't make a lot of sense.
So who are these 30%? Who are these folks that have got this huge short position?
Your average hedge fund guys that are thinking, I'm long some stock like, say, Palantir, and I need to find a short where things are going from great to good. Or they don't necessarily have to be going from good to bad. Just on the margin, things are getting worse. And that's the thesis here.
Let me kick it back to Jonathan because I know he's got to probably bring us home on this.
Well, I just think it's fascinating that great to good triggers the most shorted, most hated name in the entire S&P mid cap.
I think that you need to balance your portfolio. Personally, I think it's a terrible trade. I want to talk about the long holders list in a second, but I understand kind of that. Okay, here's maybe a better way to put it. Let's say again, I'm at Citadel. I'm managing $1 billion. I got 50 million in Palantir. I'm sitting there saying I can't just own stocks. I gotta have some shorts because if the market tanks, my portfolio is going to tank. So what do I short? What do I short? Okay, Hims went up a lot on GLPs, and we all know that's not going to last forever. So let's short it, and it'll go back down with the GLPs kind of go away. Again, it's like a simplistic caveman short, but not what I would do. But I could see how a portfolio manager would throw that in his portfolio. I could also see it not working. And I don't think it's going to work. And I think it probably will be fuel for the stock going up. But let's look at the holders list. BlackRock and Vanguard are the two big holders. They're indexers. But the third big holder is Farallon. And
they just took that stake.
Yep. Farallon. Yeah. Farallon's actually
are they 4%, Martin?
Roughly, that's what I got. Yeah.
For those who don't know who are listening, tell us a little bit about them.
Well, Farallon's one of the oldest hedge funds in the game. And they're one of the quietest. A lot of people don't. They're around San Francisco. A lot of people don't know the firm because of their, I wouldn't call it secrecy, but they don't go out of their way to make a big profile. But over 40 years, they've generated well above average returns, and their healthcare department is very well regarded on Wall Street. So, and they short a lot, by the way, different stocks, and they're obviously the third largest holder here. And after the indexers, they're the single biggest firm that is long. Now on Wall Street, not everyone gets a chance to do this, but on Wall Street, you run into each other at a banking conference or something, and you say, "Oh, John is obviously the guy at Farallon who owns this thing." And you go on a Bloomberg or the platform I'm making to replace Bloomberg, and you say, "John, you got a minute? I want to talk to you about Hims." And you pick up the phone, and some of these guys won't talk to anybody. That could be their firm policy. Some of them are basically just gossips, just gossip all day on the phone and call them a job. And some people are in between. And so there's that perspective. I don't have a lot more to say on that other than I wouldn't want to bet against Farallon, but they're a hedge fund. They're wrong sometimes. It's okay. State Street's in there. Then there's 3 or 4 quants. And I think this is really interesting. So you have Renaissance, Arrow Street, Susquehanna, and Citadel. And so Citadel is weird. The only weird one there. So the rest are just pure quants. They make markets. They facilitate options trading. They're probably long the stock because they're short the calls. And they're not short the calls because they're bearish. They're short the calls because the retail world bought the calls. Somebody has to sell them to them. And they're in the business of doing that and saying, maybe I can make a millionth of a cent doing this. So the Susquehannas, the Renaissances, the Arrow Street say, and Renaissance, I'll put an asterisk there too. They may actually like the stock. But generally, I'm selling at the calls. So now I'm short calls. I don't want to be short calls because I don't know if the stock's going to go up. So let me go buy the stock and hedge it out. And they're making these little fractions here and there. And so I think that's what's happening there. Now, Citadel has 2 businesses. They have Citadel Securities, which is like that. It's quant market making. There's nobody there that even knows what Hims does. It's just a 4-letter ticker on a screen for them. And then they have Citadel that has hundreds of smart people who are stock jocks. Either way, they own 6 million shares of this stock. So Citadel, which is the second biggest hedge fund in the world and has had enormous returns, they were 30% or so the last few years. They are the 4th or 5th biggest, 6th biggest shareholder here. So they're also, not a firm that one would bet against. And in fact, they almost certainly could not be short because, if their market maker were short or something like that, it would sort of net out. So net across all the firm, there might be somebody that's short 100,000 shares, but net, they were reporting that they're long 6 million shares. So you have Citadel and Farallon in there as very, very sophisticated investors. When I short some of these stocks that I see in retail, like I'm short these quantum stocks, for example, there is no sophisticated long holder. They wouldn't touch you with a 10-foot pole. And here you have the two of the top 5 hedge funds in the world saying, we like this stock. And Farallon, by the way, is a very long-term holder. They're not traders. When they buy a stock, they're sitting on it. Citadel, a little bit different. But, you have 2 of the 5 best hedge funds that are along the stock. You're growing 100% year over year. You got a management team that's not like some corporate McKinsey guy. The guy's built it with his own hands and taken it from no revenue to $2 billion in revenue. There's not a short seller on Wall Street could say they've done that. And he's sitting on top of the biggest industry in the world that can be transformed by technology, whether it's AI, deregulation by the new administration. There's a lot of opportunities here. I think the difficulty comes in, great, that sounds fantastic, but is my portfolio going to go up this year? And that's what all of us want to know, right? A lot of us, we like the stock. We hope that in 2030, it's up 10x, but do you have the patience to sit there and watch it go up and down 10% every now and then? It can be gut wrenching for most people. And to me, it's one of these things where, you hope to forget about it. You buy it and just wait and expect management will do wonders. And when I heard the guidance on the last call, I said, wait a second. So they're not stupid. They know what's going to happen to their GLP business. And they're still telling you that next year they're going to grow by 60%. I would think if I was short, I would hope the revenue would go down. Yeah. You're telling me it's not only not going to go down, it's going to go up 64%. I don't know if this is a short, what do you own alongside that's growing faster than that? So now, of course, some of the short sellers probably think that, they're not going to make that number. There's no way they're going to make 2.4 billion.
Yes.
And that's where the execution has to come in. And, if they have a bad quarter, this stock will go down. I mean, there's no doubt about that. But I think that they know enough about what's going on with their business that they're confident in that number. I trust them, but that is the difficult part about investing, is that for all the long-term plans in the world, we still are going to get it one quarter at a time. Do you guys know when they report next in a few weeks?
They
I
report
guess?
on
we
May
do.
5th after hours. So we have 6, not excluding today, 6 full trading days before earnings.
Yeah. So if that number is bad, we're all going to take a bath. I'm long the stock. I like
You do own Hims, Martin?
I do. I recommend it. It's a no-brainer to me. But again,
Would you like to get on the Hims House share count tracker? We're at 2.5 million shares owned by Hims House. So like not quite Citadel.
What's the number now?
We're at 2.5 million shares
Wow.
by Hims House. Not quite Citadel, but we own more than 1% of the company.
That's a good percentage of retail, I would imagine.
Yeah, it's like 20, maybe 25% of retail.
Well, Two Sigma and D. Shaw own roughly, and Cube. These are interesting firms. They own about 2 million shares. Again, I want to talk about these real
It's
quick.
not like I control the 2 million.
No. Yeah.
Right. But it's a community number.
Well, Two Sigma is one of the top 5 hedge funds in the world. It's a quant firm, no humans. My co-founder of my software company worked there. And these guys have also made 20 to 30% a year for a long time, which is why they're so big. And they own 2 million shares. They're not short. D.E. Shaw, which is very similar, this is where Jeff Bezos worked before he started Amazon. They own 2 million shares. And then finally, this very mysterious new kid on the block in the quant world called Cube, Q-U-B-E. These guys own 2 million shares. So they own 1.9, 1.9, and 1.8-ish. So the quants love this stock. Renaissance, Aerostreet, every quant is in this thing. And quants are funny. There's this guy, I'd recommend following him on X. His name is Cliff Asness. His firm is called AQR. It's one of the biggest quant firms. And unlike a lot of these other guys that kind of don't talk about quant much, he actually, they publish papers. They sort of walk through their process. And the reality is, while a lot of people think these quant firms are doing some like black voodoo magic that's like really complicated, at the end of the day, when you write these programs, it's not that hard to say if revenue, it's not as simple as Python. If revenue growth greater than 50% and if, price to sales is less than 10x, I mean, again, you don't have to be a genius to do it. And it seems like the whole damn quant industry, Jane Street's in there. Jane Street owns 3 million shares. I'm not even sure the only fund that AQR is the only one that's kind of not in there. SquarePoint is another one. I know all these guys because I do a little quant investing. But virtually every quant fund, save for that one fund, I mean, is long Hims, which is telling you like, oh no, AQR owns 150,000 shares. So there you go. But the quant firms have, as I mentioned, they completely destroyed Wall Street. It's when I say destroyed, I don't mean it in a bad way. They're better than humans, and they have all the assets under management now. Guys like Jim Cramer, who I worked for, if he were to have a hedge fund today, he couldn't survive against these firms that have these gigantic automated systems that are just making money left and right. And yes, about probably more than half of their money making comes from that ultra high frequency trading where you go to buy a stock for 25 cents and somehow magically they buy it for $25 and they magically buy it for $24.99. That is part of the business. But another part of the business, because like any capitalist, they try to grow their company. Another part of the business is stock picking. I mean, they're trying to find stocks that they think are going to go up 10x. And while they're not always right, they are right enough of the time that they have the best returns in the business. So the best investors in the world, technically, are long Hims. And these guys have outperformed Warren Buffett. These guys have outperformed, virtually anyone. If you know about Renaissance and some of these firms, their returns are ungodly. And those are after their huge fees. So the whole quant complex is long. So that's not such a bad sign. So I'm in. I mean, I again, the only thing that makes me nervous is that any publicly traded company has to execute every quarter. And it's a pain in the ass. And it distracts from the fact that you want to build a long-term business. But what is the number today? What is the number tomorrow? What is the number? He's looking at his SaaS thing every second, trying to figure out am I going to beat some random guy at JP Morgan's estimate? Like, who cares? Build a real business. That should be what it is. But unfortunately, to be a publicly traded company, that comes with the territory.
Jonathan, you can ask them. Go
Yeah,
ahead, Jonathan.
I know we've taken a ton of your time, but this is fantastic. I want to close with valuation. You said you wanted to get into it. We've touched on it briefly. Hims is at like $6 billion market cap right now. How do you think through valuation? What are the right comps? And maybe if you could leave us with a price target or a framework to think through that.
Yeah, not easy, of course. Long story short, I think we can get to like 20 billion in relatively near term. Market tends to look forward several years. And one of the things that I think isn't appreciated is the market tends to take away one-time costs or scaling from the income statements. What I mean by that is when a company is subscale, the market doesn't look at the earnings per share because they know that the scaling obscures the real earnings. So Hims scales really well because their marketing spend won't grow as fast, I don't think, as the revenue growth.
You're exactly right. It's been declining as a fraction of revenue.
Yeah. So in 3 years, when you reach a scale that makes more sense, and again, the 2030 estimate of, 10 million users that's double where I'm at. So if that were to happen, you're talking about, potentially as much as, $1 billion or $2 billion of cash flow, call it 1.5 in 2030. And, that's a company that's still growing, that's still going to be nimble, that's still going to have a great CEO that's gotten you where you're at. And I would discount from a 2030 number. I think one of the biggest mistakes growth investors make is they try to discount from a 2025 or 2026 number when like these guys are still getting their business set up and they're still like, kind of scaling. So it doesn't make a lot of sense that like, for example, if they need to do, a $50 million ad campaign, on a certain revenue base, you can't do a $100 million ad campaign or a $150 million ad campaign. They just kind of don't exist in 2030. One of the things we learned in pharma is that you literally can't buy enough ads. There's not enough inventory. Lilly, if you ever watch television, you'll see this. Every ad's a pharmaceutical ad because if you have a $10 billion drug, right? You literally can't spend enough money. I mean, so pharmaceuticals have like an 80-90% operating margin depending on the drug if they're big enough. So the point is like there are things like that you may not appreciate, even like core infrastructure stuff that are going to depress earnings. And when you scale out of that, your earnings, your operating margin will be a little more realistic, and it's higher. And so I think that even in 2030, it's probably not going to be what I'd call steady state earnings. But if you assume steady state earnings in 2030 of, $4 or $5 a share or $6, I think, getting a triple digit stock price is pretty reasonable. Now, you do have to wait. And again, what I find with a lot of investors is they want to turn a small portfolio into a huge portfolio. Of course, we all do. But the reality is getting a triple in 2 or 3 years is very hard to get, and I think that a lot of people might look at their portfolio and say, well, even if I triple my portfolio, it's not that much. But the reality is, for the rest of us, hopefully, where triple does make a big difference, getting a triple over 3 or 4 years or whatever it may be, I mean, that's about as good as you can get as an investor. And again, what's nice is you have a management team. A lot of times in pharma, we can find doubles and triples, but management doesn't matter because it's just about the drug. Here, you have a management team that you can follow to the next, sort of phase of growth. And Andrew may be one of the few managers who's good at all stages of a company. Very few managers. I'm very good, for example, at the smaller stage of a company. Once a company gets to 200 to 300 people of mine, I start to get annoyed. I don't want to go to the meetings. I don't want to, it's just, and the board's going to figure out that I don't like them. And, it's just a mess. It's just the way it works because I'm good at inspiring that little 0 to 1 motley crew of guys to make something real. And then I like to hand it over to somebody that can handle that stuff. Zuckerberg was one of the rare guys who I could do it at 100 million revenue. I could do it at $1 billion in revenue. I could do it at 10 billion in revenue, et cetera. And I hope he's the guy that can do it here. So far, he's been perfectly right from 0 to 2 billion. And, even if we can get to that $4 or $5, $6 a share of earnings in 2030 or more, you can still ride the jockey for your years to come, assuming that, they can figure out what's next. I think that the online pharmacy system will basically replace the CVSs and the Walgreens over time, but they have this knack for driving customers to their product that is really uncanny. And I think we'll continue. And then again, what's next? What's the next vertical? What's the next thing that's going to happen in digital health? I think that if we have a recession, it could actually be one of the best things for HIMSS because they're financially strong. So when there's a recession, it's really when bigger companies tend to make the most amount of money because they can sort of strategically acquire competition and consolidate in a time when nobody has capital. This is a company that's cash flow positive. They can access the debt markets. They can access the equity markets. So if there is a recession, you get you probably will get a stock price that drops. But, in the throes of that recession, every YC company goes bankrupt. Every Series A company goes bankrupt. And they can sit there and say, I'll take this, I'll take that, I'll take that. And the economy will come back someday. And when it does come back, we have all this stuff that we didn't have before. So I think HIMSS being a survivor of this, and there's something talked about in the VC world of the 2021 kind of like digital health bubble, where, these companies were just getting thrown hundreds of millions of dollars, and most of them have sort of imploded. Even those companies will probably be, at some point, all properties of HIMSS, if HIMSS even wants them. So, it's one of my favorite picks for sure. I'm really excited. I don't see in a million years how shorting it makes sense. But again, they have to deliver every quarter, which is the only thing that, keeps me up at night.
Well, Martin, thank you so much for coming on the show. This has been HIMSS House episode 26 with Martin Shkreli. I'm going to implore all of our listeners to listen all the way. I think we're at 93 minutes, far and away the longest episode we've ever done. And I think each minute was worthwhile. So Martin, thank you so much for coming on the show. We'll be certainly following along with Godel Terminal and everything that you do, and hope to chat again soon. Thanks.
Thank you so much.